legislation was intended above all to keep minor offenders out of prison. With the prisons emptier than they were when the legislation was designed in 1988, this no longer seems to be a priority for the government.
Downing Street said the government's legislative programme for the next session of Parliament would highlight Kenneth Clarke's law and order changes. The Cabinet today agreed a legislative programme of up to 20 bills.
Cabinet ministers met today to be told of a listening government's latest climb down and to agree next year's legislative programme. The Queen's speech will include bills on coal privatisation and Sunday trading. There'll be a deregulation bill to cut red tape, freeing businessmen from restrictive rules and policemen from irksome form filling. But assuming he's not reshuffled in the meantime, the busiest minister next year will be the Home Secretary. Not only will he be tightening supervision of the security services, but the whole emphasis will be on fighting crime with a range of new law and order measures. Telling MPs today of a U-turn swift enough to qualify him as a joyrider, Mr. Clarke was tackled by his Labour shadow, who wanted a statement on royal bugging allegations.
Either these transcripts are forgeries, in which case there has almost certainly been a serious offence of criminal fraud committed, or they are genuine, in which case a gross intrusion of privacy by illegal means has taken place. In either event, given that he is responsible both for criminal justice and issues concerning the royal family, are not these matters right for serious and urgent investigation, irrespective of the position of the security services?
Mr. Clarke delighted his backbenches with his riposte to the shadow who's become the Tories' dread, querying his choice of priorities.
He kicks off by making his first priority questions, presumably placed on behalf of the Daily Mirror, to try to sell rather sleazy royal books in order to ask me to inquire into utterly ridiculous allegations, which he knows perfectly well there is no shred of support whatever. He really is a tabloid politician, unable to turn his attention to any serious criminal matters at all.
The Tories have been alarmed at Labour's progress on law and order, hence next year's programme. They were relieved that Mr. Clarke is scrapping the unit fine scheme rather than tinkering with it. And tomorrow, the Prime Minister, speaking to Scottish Conservatives, will seek to restore Tory credibility on the issue they used to call their own. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Westminster.
The last remaining shipbuilding yard on Tyneside, Swan Hunter, has called in the receivers 2 days after losing a Royal Navy order for a helicopter carrier. The order was vital to the yard's future. Now it's feared all the 2,200 jobs at Swan Hunter could be lost.
It took less than 48 hours for Swan Hunters to collapse after losing a critical contract to its arch-rival at VSEL in Barrow. Managers shared the pain of a workforce whose best has not proved good enough.
This tragic outcome is a bitter blow to a dedicated and superb workforce and design team, to the local economy and to high-technology manufacturing industry on Tyneside.
Trade unions have to believe the receivers will find a new buyer for the yard. It's not much of a chance, but it is the only chance they've got.
We were very, very depressed the other day. That's turned to anger, but there's a realisation today, most important of all, that we've got to keep on going. Swan Hunter Limited is not dead.
Once almost half the world's ships were built on Tyneside.
A smash hit for Swan Hunters. With modernisation, the Alluring Palm is launched 17 weeks ahead of schedule, a shrewd reply to critics of the speed of British shipbuilding.
30 years on, the new frigates lying alongside Swan Hunter's yard may be the last ships ever built on the Tyne. Contractors were turned back from the shipyard this morning. Industries supplying Swan Hunter employ around 4,000 people whose futures have been thrown into sudden doubt. A council task force is already planning how to cope with the inevitable redundancies and how to assist in the receiver's search for a company that wants to invest in British shipbuilding.
Our intentions and our lobbying with the government departments and with government ministers is quite clear that we can't afford to lose shipbuilding on Tyneside. We can't afford to see the diffusion of the skill base that Swan Hunters has actually built up.
On the site of one discarded shipyard, a business park now stands. Ministers claim 10,000 new jobs are being created on the banks of the Tyne, but that hasn't made up for those lost from the shipyards and the mines, whilst new white-collar employers aren't often looking for men whose skill is building ships. Peter Morgan, BBC News.
Swan Hunter has been badly hit by a fall in the number of new ships being ordered by the Ministry of Defence. The Labour MP for Newcastle East, Nick Brown, said the government had privatised the yard as a warship builder, but now wouldn't give it warships to build.
Even before the end of the Cold War, the Royal Navy was shrinking under the pressure of a tightening defence budget. For most of the last decade, only 1 or 2 new warships have been ordered on average each year, a rate too low for the shipyards, but, according to some experts, sufficient for the Navy in an age of high technology.
A modern warship is basically a computerized control center equipped with weapons, much more than an older warship was, which was fundamentally a very simple weapons platform. A frigate like this here, a Type 22 frigate, has got very long-range sensors, very effective weapons. It can cover an area much more effectively than an old ship could, and therefore you don't need as many of them.
That reduction has been underway for years. In 1971, the Navy could boast 61 frigates and destroyers, the principal fighting ships. By 1981, there were 48. Now there are 40, and many say that could slip to 35 in a few years' time. But tonight, the Defence Secretary said it wasn't the reductions that had caused Swan Hunter's demise.
Let's be quite clear. The sad news about Swan Hunter isn't because there wasn't an order available. It's because they didn't win the tender for an order. We brought forward the helicopter carrier ship. It's a very important ship worth £160 million to the defence budget.
But another sign of pressure on the defence budget was the announcement today of a withdrawal from Belize in Central America. 1,300 British soldiers and airmen have been guarding the former colony from its neighbour Guatemala. Now ministers say Belize is safe and the troops are needed elsewhere, Bosnia for example, though critics, including Conservatives, call the move a mistake.
Our international prestige as a member of the Security Council of the United Nations depends on our playing a full role in various parts of the world. Our presence in Belize is inestimable in its value in regard to the Southern American scene. So I think it's very foolish to sacrifice that for the sake of what appears to be about £9 million.
Though these cuts are criticised as severe, there may be worse to come. Faced with a falling budget, defence officials have plans to cut a further 4 brand new submarines, another fighter squadron and other units as well. Measures that are expected to be confirmed within the next 2 months. David Shookman, BBC News at the Ministry of Defence.
A 24-year-old nurse has been found guilty of murdering 2 children in her care at Grantham and Kesteven General Hospital 2 years ago. Beverley Allett has also been found guilty of causing grievous bodily harm to 3 more children. Tomorrow, the jury will consider 18 other charges against her.
Parents wept as a jury at Nottingham Crown Court returned the first 8 verdicts after 2.5 days considering the evidence. The judge, Mr. Justice Latham, had asked the jury to tell him what progress they had made. With Beverley Allett still absent sick from the dock, the jury foreman went through all 26 charges, listing their decisions. They found Allett, currently in Rampton Hospital, guilty of the murder of Claire Peck and Becky Phillips. Becky Phillips, a premature twin, died aged 9 weeks after spending a short spell in Grantham Hospital with a stomach bug. The Crown said her parents had woken at home in the middle of the night to discover Becky had died. The court was told she'd received a large dose of insulin. Mr. John Goldring, QC, for the prosecution, said the Phillips were so grateful for the help they received from Nurse Allett that they made her godmother to their other daughter. Claire Peck, aged 15 months, died in hospital after being admitted with asthma. One nurse told the court of finding Claire in the care of Allett as they tried to revive the baby. Her lips, ears and face had turned blue, the court heard. Claire died in her mother's arms with staff looking on, including Beverley Allett. The baby had died from an injection of lignocaine and potassium. The jury found Beverley Allett not guilty of attempting to murder 3 other children, but guilty of causing them grievous bodily harm. All had been patients at the Grantham Hospital. The jurors have now gone off to spend a 3rd night at a hotel and will resume tomorrow considering the 18 remaining charges, including 2 of murder. Sue and Peter Phillips, the parents of Becky, will also be back in court tomorrow, the 4th day since the jury was sent out. Mike Mackay, BBC News, Nottingham.
At least 12 young children are still being held hostage at a nursery school in Paris by a masked gunman who's demanding a ransom of £12 million. Police have surrounded the building and a special squad is standing by.
As word spread that a class full of small children had been taken hostage, parents and relatives raced to the school. which is situated in one of Paris's wealthiest suburbs. There was something approaching panic. Some of the children from other classes were clearly distressed by the turmoil. Others were gratefully embraced by their parents. Police were soon on the spot. They knew the man, thought to be in his 30s, was armed and was claiming to be carrying a bomb. Men from the Special Rapid Intervention Force were called in. As negotiations continued over the gunman's demand for a ransom of about £12 million, marksmen took up position on roofs in the neighbourhood. But the authorities preferred to talk. Supplies of food and drink were taken in. And at intervals throughout the day, the gunman released some of the children, either singly or in small groups. They told their parents what was happening inside.
He told me there was a man with a gun and something which would explode.
Reports from inside the school this evening said that the children had had a rest this afternoon and were playing peacefully. The gunman was reported to be in a calm state of mind. Tonight, sleeping bags were brought for the children still in the school and something to help them sleep. But the hope is that this whole incident will soon be over and peacefully, and they'll be able to pass the night in their own beds. Stephen Jessel, BBC News, Nui.
Fighting is continuing between Muslims and Croats in Bosnia-Herzegovina despite a ceasefire agreement signed yesterday. The violence is centred on the town of Mostar, where there have been running battles. Dozens of people are reported killed. From Mostar, Martin Bell reports.
It isn't getting any easier here or safer. This was to have been the day when the roads were opened, prisoners were exchanged and the guns fell silent. None of that actually happened. The latest ceasefire was supposed to have come into effect an hour and a quarter ago. It simply hasn't. There have been fierce exchanges of small arms and machine gun fire, and as long as this lasts, all talk of truce is a dream. The big picture is hard to get. The small picture, a series of skirmishes where any move a soldier makes can be his last. These were Croatian troops on their way to resupply a frontline position. For the last 50 yards, they can be within line of sight of Muslim snipers near the Neretva River, dividing line between the two halves of the city. It is the most senseless of the wars of ex-Yugoslavia, in which former allies, Croats and Muslims, are destroying the city they share. And it's more complicated even than that. A Muslim, Commander Juka, is leading the Croatian street fighters against his fellow Muslims.
And we proved once again that me, myself, and my soldiers are one of the world's greatest fighters.
You've been doing street fighting?
Not Bosnia and Herzegovina, the world.
In spite of it all and through it all, Spanish UN troops were trying to patrol the front lines. But their presence, intended to suppress the fighting, seemed rather to provoke it. In early afternoon, the foreign press were ordered out of the city. No reason given, but the Croatian forces we had been with had been entirely helpful and friendly. Except to the Muslims. This looks like a fight to the finish between the two. There will be winners and losers, and the certain losers are more than 10,000 civilians trapped in the middle. Martin Bell, BBC News, Mostar.
A UN helicopter has been forced to make an emergency landing in Bosnia after being hit by gunfire. The French helicopter was taking injured civilians from the Muslim enclave of Zepar in eastern Bosnia. No one was hurt in the incident. Royal Navy helicopters also took part in the airlift from Zepar. This evening we've the first television pictures from the area, which has been under siege. Bill Turnbull reports.
The two Navy Sea Kings were hoping to evacuate 230 Muslims from Zepar today, but on this trip they could take only a dozen and 2 children. As so often the case in Bosnia, there are still many more people desperate to get out. The town of Zepar is said to have been badly damaged by days of Serb artillery attacks. But away from the town itself, the situation does not appear to be as drastic. Declared a safe zone by the UN last week, most of the population had fled to the surrounding hills when the United Nations first arrived. Now UN troops say the situation in Zepar is stable and peaceful enough at least for these people to sow the seeds of their summer crops. Questions, however, still remain as to the fate of the thousands who disappeared before the UN set up camp. Bill Turnbull, BBC News.
3 Western diplomats who were kidnapped by guerrillas in Afghanistan last month have been freed. The 3 from Britain, Germany and the Netherlands were released unconditionally after being held in a cave in Kandahar province. British diplomats in Islamabad say they've now been handed over to officials in Pakistan. The parents of the 4 teenagers who died in March in the Lyme Bay canoeing tragedy have demanded a public inquiry into their deaths. They've handed the Education Secretary, John Patton, a letter written last year to the centre which organised the canoe expedition, warning of poor safety standards. The BBC has also learned that the 4 teenagers may have drowned and not died of exposure, as had been thought. New evidence suggests their life jackets weren't inflated.
The parents of the dead teenagers are demanding a full inquiry into the disaster and proper regulation of commercial adventure centres, increasingly used by schools. Today, they put their case to the Education Secretary.
We believe that regulations need to be brought about for these centres, and we believe that no other family has to go through the nightmare that we're going through and have been through and are continuing to go through.
I was reasonably pleased with the reaction we got from Mr. Patton today. You can see a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel.
A BBC South West investigation has disclosed that the Adventure Centre, run by a company called Active Learning and Leisure, was warned by 2 instructors 10 months before the disaster of severe safety shortcomings. The letter concluded in the starkest terms, saying, "We think you should have a very careful look at your standards of safety. Otherwise, you might find yourselves trying to explain why someone's son or daughter will not be coming home." It's also emerged that the life jackets the teenagers were wearing weren't inflated. Some of the dead may have drowned. A partially inflated life jacket works in calm water but not in rougher seas. Inflation is simple and provides greater buoyancy. It's another point the parents' demand is explained. The Dorset police continue their investigation into the canoe deaths. A file is expected to be sent to the Crown Prosecution Service soon. A coroner's inquest, which was due to resume earlier this week, has been delayed. Laurie Margolis, BBC News, Westminster.
The European exchange rate mechanism is under renewed pressure after Spain and Portugal had to devalue their currencies today. Britain's been out of the system since last September. Spain said its currency was under pressure from foreign speculators. The peseta has been devalued by 8% and Portugal's escudo by 6.5%.
Shunning all publicity, the members of the EC's Monetary Committee emerged after a day of difficult talks, overseeing yet another realignment in the embattled exchange rate mechanism. The officials admit the speculators have won again, seemingly able to pick off the weaker currencies at will. As the news was released, it was further evidence that the system designed to prevent wild currency fluctuations isn't operating as it should. This time, the peseta and the escudo, the victims, forced to devalue.
The bilateral central rates of the Spanish peseta and of the Portuguese escudo against other currencies of the exchange rate mechanism have been reduced.
The deepening Spanish recession with unemployment nearing 22% has led to today's devaluation. High interest rates needed to defend the peseta's position in the mechanism have proved untenable. The ERM certainly isn't dead, but its credibility is in doubt. It limps from crisis to crisis, unable to ensure stability. EC finance ministers will consider next week whether the mechanism needs changing. The Chancellor, Norman Lamont, claims there are fault lines, but others aren't convinced, admitting only that devaluation should happen more frequently to diffuse tension.
Central banks and monetary authorities have to prove that they can take the initiative and just adjust rates when it's necessary.
Privately, some EC officials acknowledge such minor tinkering may not be enough. The upheaval's expected to continue. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, Brussels.
Britain's biggest teachers' union, the NUT, has voted overwhelmingly to boycott this summer's school tests in England and Wales. The Prime Minister said he was very sad at the decision and called on the union to abandon its boycott. The NUT leadership said 96% of teachers who voted were in favour of the action, which has the support of 2 other teaching unions. It said it expects only a handful of schools to go ahead with the tests. Firefighters have decided unanimously to hold a strike ballot over pay. The government is limiting public sector rises to 1.5%, but the Fire Brigades Union wants to preserve the pay formula, which was introduced after the last strike in 1977.
Britain's firefighters are heading towards a clash with the government over pay. For 15 years they've had their own special wages formula. Now they fear it'll be scrapped to keep increases within the 1.5% public sector pay limit. And the fire service is bracing itself for confrontation. Today, delegates to the Fire Brigades Union Conference were told that the pay formula, secured after a 9-week strike in the late 70s, must be protected. Otherwise, ministers face another backlash in public opinion.
John Major said, the government have been given a bloody nose. Well, the message I want from this conference to government is, don't force us to strike. Take us on, and you'll get an even bloodier nose to us.
Firefighters' pay is currently linked to the top 25% of male manual earnings. But come November, that may exceed the government's pay ceiling. Listening to the debate was a representative from the fire service employers. But he said there hasn't even been an offer yet, and the firefighters are jumping the gun.
It's really quite premature, 6 months in advance of the review date, when we have never before talked about fire service pay that far in advance of the review date, to be considering a ballot for strike action.
The FBU believe firefighters do a dirty, dangerous job, but for them it's an issue of principle. Unless their pay agreement is retained, there should be a ballot for a strike. There's been little stomach amongst most public sector unions to test the pay limit, but it's clear that if a challenge is to come, it'll be from the firefighters. John Fryer, BBC News in Bridlington.
The Italian Senate has voted to strip the former Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, of immunity from prosecution. Mr. Andreotti himself voted in favour of the move. He says he wants to clear his name, following claims that he was involved with the head of the mafia.
After decades in power, betrayal is bringing down Italy's ruling class. The majority of senators today delivered Giulio Andreotti into the hands of the judges, who can now continue the investigations and make formal charges. By saying that he wanted to prove his innocence in court, Italy's eldest statesman was merely bowing to popular and political pressure. The most serious allegation against Mr. Andreotti is that he collaborated with this man, Totorina, the boss of all the mafia bosses, trying to prove his innocence in a jail courtroom on the outskirts of Rome. His friends called him the short one, his enemies the beast. His alleged ability to manipulate everything from the drugs trade to the stock market earned him the nickname the Accountant. But Totorina describes himself as a simple working man. Already convicted of several murders and now charged with scores more, his confidence, even behind bars, is chilling. The former mafia boss is in jail and the former Prime Minister may end up in the dock thanks to a growing number of mafia informers who've been encouraged to talk under the state's witness protection program. But how reliable are the allegations of convicted criminals?
It's a mistake to believe that they are now talking about the political man just because they want to destroy the political man. My opinion is that they are now talking about this very important connection between mafia and policy just because they feel more secure.
For now, the authorities have got the upper hand in the war against organized crime, but the question is when and how the mafia will strike back. Matt Fry, BBC News, Sicily.
Tonight's main news again. The government has scrapped its means-tested fine system as part of sweeping changes to the Criminal Justice Act introduced within the last year. More on Newsnight on BBC2 at 10:30, but from the 9 o'clock news, good night.
Question time tonight comes from Leeds, and on the panel will be the Energy Minister Tim Egger, Frank Dobson, Labour spokesman on employment, the head of the policy unit at the Institute of Directors, Anne Robinson, and John Monks, Deputy General Secretary of the TUC. All on Question Time, the nation's most popular talking shop, tonight at 10:45 on BBC1.
Good evening. Now the main story from the Look North newsroom. After 2.5 days of deliberation, the jury in the trial of the former Lincolnshire nurse Beverley Allett has found her guilty of murdering 2 children. She was also found guilty of causing grievous bodily harm to 3 others at the Grantham and Kesteven Hospital where she worked. The jury has still to reach verdicts on 18 other charges. One of the children who was murdered by Beverley Allett was 9-week-old Becky Phillips. Phil Connell reports.
Happy birthday, dear Katie.
A child's second birthday party. It should have been a happy occasion, but Katie Phillips is brain damaged and her twin sister Becky is dead. Becky was taken to Grantham Hospital for a checkup after being sick. Nurse Allett injected her with a high amount of slow-working insulin. Becky had been taken home before the insulin started to affect her.
I was sort of watching my life, my world falling apart around me and couldn't do anything about it. I was trying to resuscitate Becky. I was crying, I was trying to shout orders to Sue and to try and get Emma awake, trying to do everything at the same time.
They didn't really find out what had happened to Katie's sister until the police called 2 months later.
I just couldn't believe it, and they actually had to sit down and explain to me why they knew it was her. I could see why, it just added up in the end, but it's just she didn't look that sort of person, or act it even.
Mr. and Mrs. Phillips say their lives have now been turned upside down. They continually wonder how different their lives might have been had Allett not been responsible for their daughter's care.
And that's it from me tonight. The next bulletin is in Breakfast News tomorrow morning. Now the national weather forecast.
Good evening. 2 seasons in one today. Bitterly cold in the north, very wet too, windy, some snow even. Warmer in the south, although there were some thundery showers. The dividing line is this particular cold front. It will move on southwards. It's been moving southwards during the course of today. At least it has in the west, but it hung fire across Scotland. The reason why it was so wet in many places there, and some really violent thunderstorms incidentally over Germany. There's the area of low pressure. It'll drift a little bit northwards tonight and then eventually out into the North Sea tomorrow. And as it moves out into the North Sea, as you can see here from the winds, they swirl around it and eventually they get pulled round to the north or the northwest across the whole country, introducing that cooler weather in the process. An awful lot of rain at the moment across the north. There's some thunder mixed in it. There's some sleet and snow as well, more particularly over the hills, but even at some lower levels, wintry showers continuing in the far north of Scotland. For the southern part of the country, mostly dry to begin with, but a little bit of rain showing up even there before the night's out. It'll be mild in the south, jolly cold in the north. If you get a bit of shelter, you'll end up with temperatures below freezing and a frost. There again is that area of low pressure. It'll move on out of the way tomorrow. It's going to be a very slow process, which means southern Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England look set for some spells of really wet weather still, and some sleet mixed in it, especially over the hills. Slowly but surely during the course of the day, it'll brighten up over most of Northern Ireland. It's going to be late in Counties Antrim and down though before it eventually brightens up. And at the same time, that rain, sleet and even snow working northwards again through central and eventually back into northern Scotland. As for Wales and the more central and southern areas, a little bit of brightness perhaps here and there to begin with, and then we'll have some outbreaks of rain coming across from the west during the course of the day, eventually followed by brighter conditions, although in that brighter weather there will be a scattering of showers. Quite a cold day again in the north, and colder than it has been today in those western parts of the country as well. On Saturday we'll find that heavy rain working its way out of the way over Scotland, then it's sunshine and showers for most of us, and then on Sunday I think some more wet weather moving up from the south, eventually just about across the whole country. Good night to you.
The last thing we ever do is cancel the train.
This train has been cancelled due to staff shortage.
Yeah, make sure you get this on camera.
Passengers everywhere looking for a train.
They're ripping people off left, right and centre.
So you've got 56 drivers to do 88 drivers' work.
They just play musical platforms with us.
Basically, we are a broken railway at the moment.
Old, Dirty and Late. Inside Story, Wednesday 9:30 on BBC1.
BBC2 in 10 minutes watches a group of girls from a Nigerian village being prepared for marriage. This entails being fattened up, instructed in the art of womanhood and submitting to a public chastity test. Here on BBC1 now, we join Nick Ross and Sue Cook for this month's Crimewatch UK.
Good evening. After a remarkable series of results from last month's programme, let's see if we can do as well tonight. And actually, judging by the results of one call that's coming now as I speak to you, presumably as a result of our trailers, maybe the sort of information we're going to get is going to be rather good. All the reconstructions last month had a big response, including an arrest for murder. First, the abduction in Hertfordshire. A bank manager's mother was kidnapped by a gang, hoping to obtain a ransom. After over 100 calls, possible suspects were identified in London and in Bedfordshire. 2 men named in London seem to fit descriptions of the abductors, and inquiries are now underway.
And detectives are also busy with new clues on the murder of Jean Bradley. Mrs. Bradley was on her way home from work when she was stabbed for no apparent reason as she got into her car in Acton in West London. We had well over 600 calls here with 300 possible sightings of the killer. A shred of a plastic carrier bag, which we showed, was identified by the director of a manufacturing company in Ayrshire. We now know that it came from a bag like this. It says Narcissus on it. Police need to hear from any traders who've ever used bags like these, or from anyone who might know anything about them. Perhaps you've used one. Anyway, here's our number here, 081 811 8181.
And detectives pass on their thanks to more than 150 viewers who called about the murders of Harry and Nicola Fuller in Sussex. Several callers gave the same name, and police have now arrested and charged a man with the double murders. He's been remanded in custody, awaiting trial.
Cases where an elderly person is murdered at home are extremely rare. We notice them when they do happen because they're so unusual and because they cause such shockwaves. Certainly it'll be some time before the community around the village of Martlesham in Suffolk recovers from the shock of the murder of 82-year-old Doris Shelley in February. Nobody knows why anybody would have wanted to kill her. The motive may have been burglary, although police haven't yet discovered anything missing from her house. Mrs. Shelley had lived in the old mill house for the past 30 years.